everyone. Welcome to this new episode of the Swift Academy, the podcast. It's For me, it's my great pleasure to introduce a special guest today, who is Daniel Steinberg, who come from United States of America, from Cleveland. Daniel, it's a professional, multifaceted professional with PhD in mathematics from, I think, the Case Western Reserve University. He have a lot of vast knowledge and expertise to his role as consultant, writer, editor, coder, and also a podcaster. In addition, for his professional career, Daniel is passionate about storytelling and is dedicated to helping other developers and share their own story through various media. Today, we have a privilege of delving into the existing world of macro with Daniel Steinberg. Please join me in welcome him. Hello, Daniel, and how are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Today we'll speak about very technical concept, new API that come in the last in the 2023 WWDC, which is macro. Very using macro in a lot of API since Xcode 15. You have training about that, about macro, video in your YouTube channel. Can you speak about macro briefly about macro?
Sure. So when Apple introduced macros, each year I go and look at WWDC and think, well, what's the new stuff that I'm interested in that I might want to teach or write books about?
Okay.
Excuse me. The year before it was easy. It was async, and that was an easy choice. Macros I looked at and I said, they're really not for me. And I talked to a couple people that said, well, give them another look. And there are things I can do with macros and that we can do with macros that we can't do any other way. So if you can do something by writing a function or writing an extension, you should do it that way. But if you can't, macros will enable us to do nice things. And more importantly, they affect us in the code we use from Apple. So you see macros used all over their APIs now.
Okay. But when people see the video about the WWDC, they think that it's a complicated concept with a specific target, a specific project. When you create a macro, something we have the signature of the macro. Also, how do you define the macro? You need to have some knowledge about what we call the abstract syntax tree, the AST. A lot of the syntax for me, it's not easy. I think for a lot of developers, what do you think about that?
So it's kind of a shame, and I look at my math background for that. I used to teach
Okay.
calculus a lot, and
Yes. Yes.
students that didn't do well in calculus almost never were having trouble with calculus. Calculus are some very basic, easy ideas. They were having trouble with the algebra and the preparation for it. And it's the same thing, I think, in macros. The idea of a macro isn't hard, but the syntax tree, parsing a syntax tree, building up the syntax, that is hard. But those are the things you need to do to create a macro, but that isn't the concept of macros. That's sort of the underlying infrastructure. And I agree, the Swift syntax isn't natural.
Yes, it's natural. Also, with a lot of type of macro, you think there's, example, the freestanding macro, the attached macro, etc. I think there is 7 or 6 type of macros that exist now. Okay, there is a lot of example that maybe help us to understand how macro works, how to create a custom macro, etc. But from my level in iOS development, I think it's a hard thing. But with some works that you and others developers come to the community to help us to understand how to create macro. But from your side, when we spoke about preparation to this episode, you think that it's enough to use the existing macro, not to deep dive to create a macro. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's right. I think we will use a lot of the existing macros. If you're doing Swift data, model is a macro. If you're doing observable,
Yes.
observable is a macro. Excuse me, preview is a macro. And if you want a minute, we can take a minute and look at some code, and you can see why, in my view, preview is the perfect macro. Preview is the perfect reason for someone to create a macro. Doesn't mean that we should be creating macros. In fact, the first thing I say in my book on macros is, for the most part, don't make one. But if you want to go ahead and make one, here's how you do it.
Okay. Can you maybe we can begin with some practice to show people how to deep dive in the macro in creating macro. I think that you have prepared for us a simple example using Xcode.
Well, let me dig into preview a little bit, I guess.
Okay.
Let me see if I can share that here.
Okay.
So, have I shared this?
Yes.
And so let's see. I'm in the wrong screen. I, of course, find this very confusing. So, is the preview demo on the screen with a content view? Walid?
I'm listening to you. I'm listening to you.
I'm asking, can you see content view on the screen?
Yes, I see. I see.
Okay.
I see. It's great.
So I'm gonna create a new quick empty file, and I'm gonna call it just some view.
Okay.
And in some view, I'm just going to create a view, and so I'm going to import SwiftUI, and I'll create a struct called some view, and it will conform to view, which means that it must have a body, and the body will just have some text that says hello, Walid.
Okay.
So the first thing we need to do, if we want to see it on the screen and see what it looks like in our previews, we need to create a preview. And the way we did it in the past was we'd create a struct and we'd have to give it a name. And so we would tend to call it some view underscore, I don't know, preview.
Yes.
And it would have to conform to preview provider. And if it had conformed to preview provider, then we had to implement that some way. And so it needed previews inside of it. And then we would write some view. And if you look at this, most of this code is nonsense.
Yes.
Like, it doesn't matter what you call this thing. You can call it anything you want. You can call it, I don't know. You can call it Walid preview.
Yes.
And it has to conform to preview provider. And so that means it has to have this static computed property in it. But really, the only thing that's important is this.
Yes. To call the same view. Yes.
And so if you think of this from the call site, and this is the call site, since it doesn't matter what we call it because we don't call it, Apple gave us this preview macro. And the preview macro, the only thing I have to specify is the view that I want to display.
Yes.
To me, that's the perfect macro. It lets me focus on the thing that I care about, which is this some view. And then if you expand the macro, you can see all the code
generated
that was generated.
Yes.
Here's the name of the struct. It's an awful name, but nobody calls it, so we don't care. What we care is that somehow it is a unique name. Here's the thing that it conforms to. And inside of it, there's the file information. Here's the line where it's defined. Here's the column where it's defined. This is boilerplate code we'd never want to write. To conform to that protocol, you need the make preview method, which in this case is this, and inside it is returning the some view. But the code that we see, the code that we care about is this. Thank goodness we don't have to write the boilerplate. To me, this is a perfect macro. And to get to your thing you mentioned earlier, the pound tells me that this is a freestanding macro. So freestanding macros come in two flavors. They're either expressions. So you've probably seen the pound URL macro that people use to create a URL from a string, or it's the declaration macro. So this created a struct. And what we really have here, what we really have here is a preview that the second parameter is this closure that takes nothing and returns any view. And because it's a closure, I can use it as a trailing closure. So this is really the argument to the preview macro.
Yes, it's great. I think also it's the same thing that Apple made now with Swift testing, with the expect macro, and also with the tag macro to create tags. It's the same thing, and it's facilitate also how to create things.
So you said Swift testing. Let's see
Yes.
if we can quickly. There's a unit testing bundle.
Yes.
I'll just use the default. And so what I think you said was, if I write in here an expectation, so I write a pound expect
Yes.
some condition, and so I'll just write true, even though that will always be true. This pound expect, as you said, is a macro.
Yes.
And so we can see what that is. And in addition, this at test is also a macro.
A macro. Yes.
And so at test is, and as I think you mentioned, if you define tags, at tag is also a macro.
Yes.
So this at test is a different sort of macro. This at test is called an attached macro, and that's because it modifies this method example. And so it's adding something to example. And if you look at maybe its quick help, you see that it is a peer macro. And so it's going to add things at the same level as example. And so when we expand it, and this is the other nice thing, you can't always expand Apple's macros, but sometimes you can. You see it's defined a peer to example, another member at the same level named, well, it's this unreadable name because it's, again, it's unique. And this other thing that is this other unreadable name. But the point is, this is what makes the test work.
It's great. From your side, using the existing macro, it's helpful for people. Creating it's harder, and they need sometimes to understand the different types of macro, also to understand the AST, Swift syntax, which we also, and especially the AST. What do you think that there is a lot of Swift macro help to eliminate what we call the boilerplate code that we don't need, and make some stuff to
well, it's not the code that we don't need, it's the code that we type that same repetitive code over and over again and it doesn't change, or it changes in a very simple way that if we could just swap out that name. So boilerplate is not code that we don't need, it's code that we don't need to type.
Yes, okay, yes. So, thank you for correction. It's that we don't need to type. And for your experience, how it's easy to integrate macro into existing Swift projects?
So there's a cost to it, because when you write a macro, as you keep observing, you need Swift syntax. And so when you add your own macro, you write your own macro in a separate package, and that imports depends on Swift syntax. And so that can make a clean build take a long time because you're rebuilding those packages too. It's something that Apple is certainly aware of and thinking of addressing, and we don't encounter that problem in the macros that Apple uses because things are pre-built for us, but in our own macros, you're going to encounter that.
Okay, maybe there is some issue, compatibility issues, limitation that developers should consider when they try to use Swift macro. As I think that there is a limitation in the version of iOS, or maybe I'm wrong about that. When you have projects that support iOS 13 or 14, you can't use macro to integrate macro in your projects, or maybe I'm wrong about that.
Well, like any other package, the version of Swift syntax or the version that you use in your macro does imply which versions you can use it in your project. So that's the same as any other package.
Okay, great. What do you think about maybe creating some custom macro in Swift? You have, I think, a simple example about that. And especially when you create a target a project for macro, there is a template with that Apple give to us. If you want to share with us a simple example that people can understand how to create the custom macro.
You're awfully demanding. I thought we were just going to chat.
Okay.
Let me see if I can find a. Let's see if this is the right one.
Okay. Simple. Yes.
So let's see. Are you seeing
Yes. Very great.
content view on the screen?
If you can maybe increase the font size that people. Yes. Great. Great.
Okay.
Great. Fantastic. Yes.
So what I did here was I created a new project and I used Apple's Swift Data template. And so it creates an item. So there's my model. And actually, while I'm here, why don't I go ahead and expand what model is? Model itself is a macro.
Okay.
Now, model's a really interesting macro because if I show quick help, you can see that it's more than one kind of macro.
Yes.
And so for freestanding macros, you can't mix and match. A freestanding macro is either a declaration or it's an expression. But for an attached macro, you can say, well, I want it to be a member macro. And here's a member macro that's creating things with names called backing data and persistent schema. It's creating all these things. But it is also a member attribute macro, which means it's adding the at things to things. And it's also an extension, which defines conformances to observable and persistent model. And so you can see that here. There's the members that it said it was adding.
Yes.
Right? Here is an attribute that it's added to something. And so it's a macro within a macro. It's added this at transient to it. It's added persisted property. That's an attribute that it's added. So that's a macro within a macro, which is kind of cool. Okay. And then at the very bottom, it promised that it would conform to these two protocols. And the actual conformance is inside here where it's done the stuff with the observation and created the observation registrar. So that's a lot of work being done by this model. And let me hide this again to show you. This is the code that we type. Yes. So all that boilerplate, which includes the observable, which is how we get to know when there's updates to our model, all that stuff is being written for us, and it's using
the model, the iRobust model. Yes.
Because it's an attached macro, it's using things that it can piece from here. So let's see if I can do this for you. Okay. I think I have to stop sharing this, and I have to start sharing a different window. Because you asked me about AST. One of the nice tools that we have available to us is this Swift AST Explorer.
Yes.
And so if you paste in this code, you can get the syntax tree for this code,
True.
and you can reach inside of it and say, you know what? I want to reach inside and I want to get date, or I want to get timestamp. And this shows me the path I need to take to get there.
Okay.
You'll notice that this is function parameter list syntax, even though it says over here function parameter list. This is the actual type on the left, function parameter list syntax. And you can look at the dots to see what are the things that you can reach inside and grab from there.
Yes. And this is what make harder to to understand macro. It's necessary to begin, I think, with understanding AST, the different types, etc. How to work and to play with the different types and understand the hierarchy of attributes in the macro. After that, you can, for my point of view, it will be much easier to you to understand how to create your custom macro. What do you think about that?
So I know you're very tied to this issue, and you're not wrong.
Yes.
But so there are two things. One, I have to reach into the arguments of my macro if it has any, or I have to
Okay.
reach, in the case of an attached macro, into what I'm attached to. And to
Okay.
get things in there, I do have to use Swift syntax to walk in and get the things I need.
Okay.
When I'm building up the resulting code, however, I don't tend to work with Swift syntax anymore. I use the fact that Apple has given us a Swift syntax builder notation that if I use multi-line strings, it can look at them and often create the syntax tree for me and output that. And so I'm often using the the syntax tree really.
Yeah.
I'm using the syntax tree to parse and to pull out the things that I need, but to build it up, I'm often not using the syntax tree.
Okay. 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 I understand much better the difference and because from my side I was very focused on AST and how it's difficult. I should know everything about the different attributes type, etc. If I don't understand the AST, I will have problem to create my custom macro.
It is
And
very difficult, and it is
yes.
not, in my opinion, very well documented.
Okay, okay. We have the same the same opinion about that. Uh, I think that you know that there is uh, other tools, especially when we try to create code, etc., generate code like that. There is the community creates some tools. I know that you know maybe about sorcery, etc. The project to generate code. What do you think from your experience about macro, maybe you had used sorcery before. What kind of when you compare between generating code using sorcery and generating code based on macro, something like you show to us using models, etc., test, etc. What kind of difference you think?
So I'm not the best person to talk to about things like this. So, for example,
Yes,
I didn't use reactive Swift. I waited until we had combine. I didn't
yes,
use sorcery. I waited till we had the tools because I tend to teach. And so I want to teach publicly available part of the Apple ecosystem tools, even
yes.
if that means I don't have some things available to me. So I tend to wait until we have the tools available from Apple. So I'm probably not the best person to
Okay,
compare.
okay. Because last year's in the Swift connection in Paris, Christophe from the creator of Sorcery have a question about that. Compare at this moment, he think he thought that that Sorcery have using stencil special language to generate code. It's much better in some things about comparing to Swift macro. Uh, at this moment, from last year to this year, what kind of change that you discover between the first version of macro, things evaluated by the time in this year, what kind of changes that you find about the first version of macro and now? What kind of changes in type?
So, I mean, there's small things like the
Yes.
extension macro they showed at WWDC
Okay.
had changed by the time things finally shipped. And so, for instance, if you were going to say, I want this thing to conform to the identifiable protocol, you might have
Yeah.
to define ID as part of that extension. And initially you weren't able to, and then they gave us that ability. They've added some macros since then. So for instance, we're now able to uh, apply a macro to a method that can decorate the inside of a method. And one of the examples they use in the Swift evolution proposal is they showed that you can do logging, and so that you can log when you enter the method and log when you exit the method using a defer by
Okay.
adding those using a macro. And so I think as Apple's needs evolve, as the community's needs evolve, you're going to see macros continue to grow. There's some things, for instance, that maybe the Swift testing team needs or Swift data team needs that macros can't
Okay.
do. So maybe they'll push in that direction.
Yes.
So
Yes. Yes. What,
I,
what
I
I
don't
think.
think I think they're done enough, but I don't think they're completely done. And the other thing I want to say is, you and I say that the abstract syntax tree, I'm sorry, the Swift syntax
Yes.
documentation is lacking, but I would say that's because it wasn't intended for us. It was intended
Okay.
for people that do compiler work and work at that level. And what macros has done is it's introduced a whole new audience to Swift syntax that perhaps Swift syntax was not intended for.
Okay. Let's come to maybe your when you speak about with other developers from their feedback that receiving from the Swift community regarding to macro. What kind of feedback that you have, especially in United States, etc., and Europe, because I know that you visit a lot Europe and you have a lot of discussion with other developers from the community. What kind of feedback that you have about macro in this year?
Well, it's the usual. It's as I said, the documentation of Swift syntax, which makes it hard. It's the extra compile time because you're
Mm,
dependent on Swift syntax.
yes.
And then in general, you should always be cautious about adding something custom to your code that people coming to your code base have to learn.
Okay, okay. And maybe there is some success stories about using macros. Have you maybe have any notable success story or use cases where macro have improved development workflow from people that you meet?
Well, I can show you an example
Yeah.
that 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 I came across recently, if you'd like.
Okay.
So going back to this code that was built on just the simple, you know, item, the simple Swift data template.
Okay.
One thing Apple introduced this year in Swift data was the ability to build preview data.
Okay.
And using what's called a preview modifier
Mm,
and a preview trait built on that preview modifier, you can now add sample code by specifying a trait like this.
okay.
And so your preview data you can use now and get a nicer look right away.
Okay.
But I looked at this code and hated it. And
Okay.
so perhaps I have my development methodology, hate driven development, which is
Okay.
built around me looking at code that I hate and trying to fix it. So let me just walk you through this if that's okay.
Okay.
In order to use the preview modifier like this so easily, going back to our preview data, the preview modifier must have make shared context and a body.
Okay.
And the body is what is used to decorate. What we used to do is we'd put the model container there. So in make shared context, the first thing I hated was it returns a container. Now that's because make shared context preview modifier has this associated type called context. They weren't even thinking of Swift data, which has a context and a container. They just meant context in its more generic way.
Okay.
So I didn't like that this was called context and was a container, and this is context and it's a container. But that's not really important. We can live with that. So
Okay.
what are we doing inside? We're creating a Swift data container that is in memory. So that's what's being done here. Then we create the container here by saying it's going to manage item.self. Well, actually, this is a variadic parameter. In our case, it's item.self. But if I have several non-connected graphs, I would have to do item.self, something else.self, and so on.
Okay.
So this wants to take a variadic. And it uses this configuration so it's in memory only.
Yes. Okay.
And then they had this method here that said, okay, make sample items in the container. And they did that as an extension to item.
Okay.
My hatred for this code keeps growing. And so inside this container, we build a context from the container. We add items to that context, and we save that context.
Okay.
So do you have the basic picture so far?
Great for me. You have, yes.
So,
But after that, how you can use that to generate, to link that with the macro? Because at this time, this is a simple code without using macro.
that's right.
Yes.
And so the first thing I looked at was, how can I reorganize this code so that all the boilerplate code is in one place?
Okay.
So for instance, this creating a context and saving a context, for me, that belongs here.
Okay.
If I create the context and I save the context here,
Okay.
I've got more of my boilerplate code there, and now I will pass the context over, not the container. So I will take this context, which is now a model context. And so my point here is,
Okay.
before you start writing your macro, you may have to reorganize your code. And this feels a lot like if you ever did design patterns, the work you used to do before you used the template pattern. Is you'd say, well, here's the only code that doesn't matter. So then I said, well, what are the things that depend on item? Because those are the things that are not boilerplate. And so where do I see things that are special? I see it here, item.self.
Okay.
I see it here with item.makeSampleItems. So the next thing I did was I said, let's make this the extension. I'm getting to the macro, I promise you. Let's make that the extension. And why don't I put this in a struct, which I'm going to call sample data.
Okay.
And now instead of calling this items make sample items, which seems very specific, why don't I just call this add data? And so I'm going to call this method add data, and it's no longer a static method.
Okay.
And all of a sudden, oh, maybe it does need to be a static. I'm sorry.
No problem.
But all of a sudden, and this no longer throws, so I no longer need to try this. I look here, and the only things that are special is sample data and item.self.
Okay.
And that tells me this. What if I could write preview data, a preview data macro that I passed in item.self, and this code no longer needs to be written. This is the code that gets generated.
Okay, I understand.
Now I'm happy because this is all boilerplate. well, how do I generate this so that it has item.self and it has sample data? Those are the two things it needs. And so a macro, an attached macro, knows what its parameters are, so it can pull that parameter and use it for item.self, and it knows what it's attached to, so it can say, hey, what's the name of the thing I'm attached to, and generate it.
Okay.
And so if you'd like, I can show you the macro code that I wrote.
Yes, yes.
If I can, let's see. Start that up, and I have to stop sharing. Share. And here we go.
Okay.
Okay. You create a Swift, you create a macro, a Swift macro in a package. And the package, if you look over here in the navigator, the package has sources and it often has tests. And so in the sources, you will find 3 folders. One folder, Swift Data Preview, is where we define the macro. This is the signature of the macro.
So, yes, the signature. Yes.
And so I think it's a good idea if you document this with header docs so people that use it know exactly what it is. But this is really the definition of the macro. The definition of the macro will always include this at the end, which says, here's where the implementation is. The implementation is in a module named this, in a type called this.
Yes.
My macro that I'm defining is an extension, because remember, I'm defining the struct, and it's going to generate the extension.
Yes.
It's going to conform to preview modifier, and the things I'm added are a function name body and a function name make shared context. That's
Yes.
all the boilerplate code I want to get rid of.
Okay, great.
And the parameter that I'm passing in is, in this case, going to be only item.self, but this says it can be item.self, comma, walid.self, comma, I went to the store.self. It can be any number of these things.
Okay.
So that is how we declare a macro. This is the definition. Now let's implement it.
Okay.
Every type of macro has a corresponding protocol. And you saw before, when I had a macro, I could expand the macro. And when I expand the macro, what I'm really doing is I'm calling a method called expansion. And so let's look at that in my Swift data preview macro file. Same comment, basically. I have to create expansion. And the signature of expansion is different depending on what type, of macro I'm creating. So in this case, I'm creating an extension. The node are the parameters for the macro. The declaration is whatever I'm attached to. So it's the struct I'm attached to.
Yes.
And I'm going to return an array of extensions. Now, technically, that's called extension decl syntax.
Yes.
And I'm doing it here by saying, give me an extension decl syntax that you build up from this string. The way I'm able to do that is at the top, I'm importing Swift Syntax Builder. And this is Apple's APIs for saying, you need to parse and you need to tear apart the node and the thing you're attached to using Swift syntax, but I can help you build up what you're replacing it with.
Okay. Great.
Is this okay?
Yes.
Now, the actual implementation of this might make you cry. It's that nice and easy.
Okay.
I need 2 things, remember. I need the name of the struct, and I need to pull out the types, the item.self.
Okay.
And so I have a helper method called persistent types that says you give me all of the arguments and I'll pull out the types. And it does it here by saying guard case let. I know we hate those. It says ask the node for all of its arguments. And that should be an argument list. And I want to bind what I find there to something I'm calling arguments. That's what I'm going to call it.
Yes.
Now, this is an enumeration, and there are lots of cases. But if you look at the documentation, it says it will always, in the stuff that we do, be this. It will always be the case argument list. If it's anything else, there's something wrong.
Okay.
So that's why I can guard case let. And here's the arguments. And here I'm just looking inside and saying, are there any arguments? And if there are is it an expression? And if it isn't, then I've got no arguments I can use. And if it is, I'm just going to return the arguments. And so that will be my variadic list of types. And so that's all I did to get the types.
Which is great, yes. But
now, wait, this is my favorite part.
Yes.
Do you remember that we had that boilerplate code? And there were only two things we had to fill in?
Yes,
There's one of them. That's item.self. Everything else is just literal. And the other thing we needed was the name of the struct. And that's just type.trim. And so this is my entire implementation of the macro. Now, if I was a good citizen, I would do some testing. I would test to make sure that it is a struct. I would test to make sure that it had a static member named add data. That's some testing I should do.
Okay.
But I just wanted to show you the fundamentals of, because I know you're very worried about Swift syntax. Look how nice that was.
Yes. And very, very simple. You didn't make any controls about the types that you receive. Maybe because at this moment the types it should be types related to persisting model, etc. As I see in your code, you didn't make any test about that.
I don't have to.
Okay.
The reason I don't have to is I should get a compiler error if they're not.
Okay.
So,
I understand.
So some of the things I test for, some things I don't have to test for. I hate to say this, but I do go into better examples in my book and more complete examples in my book. But I do hate. Don't buy the book. You can just watch the videos or whatever.
But for me, it's great to simplify and have to also. First of all, you should have the idea to think how macro. It's for it should have a purpose, an idea about the macro. It's not okay. I will create a macro, but for which reason we do that. In this example, we see that you have a purpose to eliminate this boiler code, if we can say, and after that you try to make some refactor before you come to create your macro. After that, it will be easy to you to understand how things that maybe change in your macro types, things that come with the arguments of the macro. And for me, how because there is a lot of types of macro.
So before you go there, I will say, you're skipping a step. And the step you're skipping is, can I do it any other way but with a macro? So for instance, in this example, the reason I couldn't do it with a method, because that's what I really wanted to do it with, is if you have a method that accepts a variadic argument, inside the method, it's converted to an array. Now, the method I had to call, which is part of Swift Data's API to create my container, demanded that I pass it variadic, and I can't convert the array back to variadics. If I could have done that, I never would have done a macro. I would have just made a method that did this for me.
Okay, okay,
So
okay.
the
This is the
first
reason.
rule of writing macros is stop. Can you do it any other way?
Before that, we think about using macro. And after that, we think, okay, there is no solution. I guess at this moment, we can't think about using macro. It's not okay. I can do that with macro. I can simplify my code using macro. Maybe there is some simple extension that simplify my code without using macro. At this moment, I don't need to use macro. It's but it needs some expertise, some to think about that. And thank you, Daniel, about this demonstration how to use a custom macro. I think that we see a lot of things how to use macro. We discover some existence macro like test macro with the new testing macro, expect, etc. Uh, we can what can of there is a lot of people that see us. What kind of advice do you give to developers that who are new to Swift macro to write their customer macro? I think that don't write a
That's my
customer.
advice: is don't write one.
But if the developers have a lot of they like the challenge, they like make things. What kind of advice do you think they can begin? But what kind of things? They understand the AST, come with some example from the WWDC, make watch some video on YouTube. What kind of advice do you can give to developers who like to write custom Swift macro?
So there were two excellent videos at 2023 WWDC
Okay.
from Alex and from Becca showing two aspects of macros, and Alex really focused on the building a macro and the Swift syntax side of it, and Becca focused on the different types of macros and when you would be using them, and they're wonderful videos. And so that's one thing. Another thing is realizing that for the attached macros, a single macro can solve more than one problem is kind of nice.
Okay.
And always look at it from the call site. If it doesn't simplify your code, when I write pound preview and I tell you what we're showing, you don't have to understand anything to know what that code does. And so it makes your code so much easier to understand. And I think that's a big deal.
Okay. For you, summer is to watch WWDC. There is a lot of two videos that can be of
From
give
2023.
2023, and for you it's they can help a lot developers to learn about creating macro. uh, Also, you don't advise people developers to create their customer their customer macro.
The other thing
uh,
is, when you
okay.
encounter a macro, you aren't always able to do it. But in the case of model and observable and pound preview, expand the macro and try to understand what someone else did to implement that.
Okay.
You see from the call site pretty much how it's declared. But if you look at quick help, you see exactly how it's declared, or you go to the definition. And if you expand, you see how it's implemented often. And there's a lot of hints on how a good macro is. Also, Swift macros, because it's part of the Swift project, it's open source. There's a whole section of examples, and they've built
Yes.
and they've tested examples of all these different kinds of macros, and so you can get a feel for how do these engineers from Apple go about building and testing and proving a macro. So that is also a great link to go to.
Okay, that come to my last question about macro. How do you envision macro can improve Swift development in the future years, transforming the Swift development, and especially when we have see with Swift testing how macro it's with Swift Swift data, a lot of using of macro, etc. it will be Swift macro everywhere, or what do you think about that?
Well, we're going to see a lot of macros. One of the nice things about Swift testing is the @test macro makes it very easy to add tags to your test, to add nice display names to your test. And so by using those parameters correctly, you can get a lot of nice behavior there. Uh, you said something else that I missed. I'm sorry.
About what your if there is Swift macro everywhere, we can find macro everywhere, etc. I think that people will have a lot of problem to understand which is macro, which not macro, etc. Because as we see in your code, not a lot of people think that iRobust model it's a macro, expect it's a macro, etc. And after that, they think, okay, we think that Apple encouraged to use macro everywhere, and
I don't think Apple encourages us to use macros everywhere. I think they encourage us to use it where it's appropriate. And for example, we have property wrappers, which look very
yes,
similar to a macro, but there was a Google Summer of Code project. I didn't see if it got staffed. And
okay,
one of the things was to say, can we re-implement, and by we, I mean, can Apple re-implement property wrappers using macros? And so maybe macros will be this underlying technology that makes these things work. It's a lot like you're swimming in macros, but it doesn't mean you have to be so aware of them. They should
okay,
be invisible to you. You use @state every day in SwiftUI, but how much do you sit and think about it? When you first learned it, you had to think, oh, @state means that this thing is being stored off site somewhere, and so I can treat this value type almost like it's a reference type. But now we use @state because we know what it does. We don't worry about how it does it. And so I think that's sort of the evolution that we go through.
okay, great, great. Thank you, Daniel. And
I
how
want to point out that I'm not an expert in macros. It's just one of the things that I've been lucky enough to
you are
learn in
very
the last couple of years.
humble. You are very humble about that. I know that you have a lot of experience. What you demonstrate to us, it's very very important. You can find this demonstration a lot on YouTube, etc. It's fewer people can make this demonstration and think about how to create custom macro, etc. That's me. For me, how do you create? Because I you have a great channel on YouTube to speak about not only macro, also combine, etc. A lot of things. When we prepare this podcast, we spoke how to you prepare your video, etc. Because a lot of developers try to create content and also great content for the community. And for me, creating content it need some time to preparation for topics, preparation of the exercise, etc. They need time. And from your experience, what kind of advices that you can give to the community to create great content about macro, about combine, about Swift concurrency, etc.
I can only tell you what I do. And
Yes.
my background is I used to be a radio DJ. And so I used
Okay.
to be on the air and people would listen to me. And so I'm never comfortable with my face on camera in these
Okay.
videos. And so I know the research says that people love seeing people's faces on camera during videos, but my videos are not. And so what I
Okay.
tend to do is I spend a lot of time on the content and the projects, and then I make keynote presentations from them.
Okay.
And then I record the audio. I go through it and I talk about things. And it's because you've heard me cough today. I make lots of like that. I make lots of
Okay.
mistakes. And so I'll look at my slides and I'll talk for 20 minutes and I'll be halfway through something. Oh, I want to say it different. And so I
Okay.
very heavily edit my audio down to about 4 or 5 minutes. My presentations tend to be very short. And so it's important to me to have well produced audio. And then the video goes along with it. And the syntax coloring I use, I think, directs your eyes at what you should watch, and you can see the code layout. So that's sort of the way I produce my videos. Everyone does it differently, and there's a lot of really good people doing content online right
Yes, great. Thank you, Daniel. It was a great podcast with you. I think that we have 1 hour of discussion about macro, etc. With great lot of in this episode we have a lot of practical demonstration, and I think that people will we have a lot of pleasure to see that with with expert in iOS the development like you. I think that I know that you don't like that, but for me, it's you are one of the expert in iOS community. I have the pleasure to meet you last year in at Paris. For me, great opportunity with other developers like Frank and Greg, etc. That we give up that they have a lot of admiration of for your work, what you give to the community. Hope you see you very soon at Paris, in Paris, and I'll let you to the final how you can finalize our podcast. Uh, the last words of the podcast for you.
Well, thank you, and I'll let people know that I go to a lot of conferences. I love to talk to people, but I tend to be very shy about going up to other people. So feel free to
Okay.
come up and say hello and chat. It'll be
Okay.
nice to get to know you.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for you to accept this invitation, and see you soon. Hello. Thank you.
Bye.